So good morning, my name is David Wise, and this morning we're working on the multicultural segment of our SeniorFlix, and our guest this morning is Alain Côté. Alain is a regular volunteer here at Shepherd Village, so he's well known at Shepherd Village, and so now Alain, I'll turn it over to you. And so you were born in Quebec.
That's right.
And so your native tongue is French. So tell us a bit about your background.
Okay, yes, I was born in Quebec, and my name is Alain Côté. And Côté is a very popular name in Quebec, by the way. If you spend any amount of time in Quebec, visiting or working, you're bound to meet a Côté. There are thousands and thousands. In fact, somebody told me once that in terms of numbers, the Côtés are the second most, they ranked number 2.
Yeah.
And of course, every time I say this, people say, no, who's number 1? So then I say Tremblay. And then I add, my brother married a Tremblay. So between the two of them, I think they're related to half of the population.
You got it
anyway,
covered.
The first Jean Côté came to Quebec City in 1635. I am the 10th generation Canadian because I've prepared my straight lineage from me, my father, his father, all the way up. I'm in the 10th generation. And so when I grew up in Quebec in the 1950s, the province was pretty conservative, a little bit like Ontario here. And in fact, we had some kind of a conservative government, Union Nationale, under Maurice Duplessis. He was premier for 20 years, almost, and he had a tight grip on everything in the province. In terms of education, the education was managed by the religious orders, brothers and nuns, and the priests. They managed most of the elementary and secondary schools. In terms of social life and lifestyle, it was pretty quiet. Nothing too much, nothing too exciting, and so forth. And so that's the way it was. And of course, it was very French. And then, of course, at the beginning of the 60s, everything changed. Like many other places in the world, there was a kind of a movement towards, I don't know, I would call that liberalization. In 1960, in fact, we elected a liberal government in Quebec, and they started to introduce progressive measures and to reform things, make them more modern. Like, for example, they nationalized the electricity. They used to be run by all kinds of private companies. Now, one agency, Hydro-Québec, or Quebec Hydro, anyway. And just like in Ontario, you have one agency mostly. And then they took control of the education, so they created a proper Ministry of Education. So they changed many things during that time. And I was born and grew up specifically in Trois-Rivières, which is halfway between Montreal and Quebec City. And it is very French. Like even now, I would say the population is at least 95 or 96% French. So I went to elementary school there, secondary school there. In fact, it's so French, it's a good place to learn French. The local university, the L'Université du Québec at Trois-Rivières, from which I graduated, has an excellent summer program and a French immersion program. It's well known, and it works very well because it's all French. They do side trips to Quebec City and so forth, so it's very good. But on the other hand, it's not a good place to learn and practice English.
Yeah, that's interesting because I remember driving through Quebec in the 50s, and it was not easy to get understood with my English. So where did you learn English then?
Well,
Alain?
That's a good question. I did 3 out of 4 years of university in Quebec, as I mentioned. But the second year, I was fortunate to do it in a small American university in Canton, Ohio. I had some teachers in Quebec that had been there to study English, so I was aware of that. Small university, Canton, Ohio, just south of Cleveland. So I went there for actually 12 months, from August 67 to August 68. And that was my own English immersion program. And interesting, because when I went there, I could I could speak English a little bit, like we studied English in high school, just like here, you study French in high school, but that was my high school English, But because I arrived there a few weeks before the start of the classes, so by the time classes started, I was already more used to the language. And the classes, actually, the courses, that was the easy part. The teachers, they speak slowly, clearly, not too much problem there. The problem was having a conversation with a lot of people talking together, using slang words.
Yes.
That took time to get used to that.
Yes.
But in the end, it was a very good experience for me. It brought my fluency of English at the level it is now. But I didn't lose my French accent. It was too late for that. Okay, so I've been speaking English with a French accent ever since. So I went back to Trois-Rivières, as I said, to finish my university in French. And I graduated with a BA in French literature, with a teaching degree. So the plan was to teach French to French students in French schools in Quebec. Now, I was in the workforce for 46 years. I have never done that, not a single day. Okay? Life happens. What can you say? So
yeah, well, that's interesting. So you're speaking Canadian English with a French accent, and I'm speaking Canadian English with an English accent. So we've got things in common, Alain. So
That's right.
So you grew up in Trois-Rivières, and how did you end up in Toronto then?
Well, that's a good question, but I think first we're going to go to Ottawa. I did teach a couple of years in Quebec first, but in an English school, so French as a second language, and I was not totally happy with that. So then I got a job as a translator for the federal government in Ottawa. It was a good time. They needed, because of the Official Language Act, in the late 60s, they needed a lot of translators and interpreters and so forth. So I got a job there. And I figured at the time that I would be better working with words rather than with kids. And I was right, okay? I was a translator for 32 years, but not all for the federal government. So after a few years, I switched to the private sector. There was this new translation firm that was started by my two friends of mine, husband and wife. They left the government, started their own translation firm, offering translation services to the government and to private companies, and they really wanted to have me on board. Well, I hesitated. You've got a good job in the federal government with a good pension in 35 years, And but finally, after about a year of hesitation, I decided to join them. And I did that for 5 or 6 years. And then one morning in 1986, in February 1986, they come and talk to me, how would you like to work in Toronto? Whoa, how come? Well, they were thinking of expanding and opening a second office, and this time in Toronto. They thought it would be a good place to expand. Well, I said, I would like that, but I'm going to ask my wife first what she thinks about that. And my wife is English speaking, by the way, but she speaks good French. The order is the reverse, English, French, and me it's French, English. We thought about it for a while, and we decided to do it. So shortly after Labor Day in 1986, we arrived in Toronto. Now, we had already bought a house here. My company paid for a couple of weekend trips for us to come and find a house before moving here. They paid for the move. They gave me a nice salary. That was a very generous offer, but there was one condition. I had to commit for at least 2 years. If after 2 years I didn't like it, or we didn't like it, my wife and I, they would take us back. They would pay for our move back to Ottawa and back in my old job. After 2 years, I was not interested in going back to Ottawa. as much as I liked Ottawa and the whole area, we were living on the Quebec side, by the way, what was at the time Elmer, Quebec. Now they merged and it's Gatineau. So we had a house there, we liked it. We were very close to nature. The Gatineau Hill were right behind us. We had opportunities to speak English and French on a daily basis. We were exposed to both cultures and a few other cultures too. We were happy there, and we had our daughter there. She was born while we were there, and we said, well, we could spend the rest of our lives here, But then, things happen.
So you've lived here now for almost 40 years then, so there's obviously things you must like about Toronto.
Yes. As I said, as much as I like Ottawa, we liked Ottawa. It's a decent-sized city offering a lot of things and bilingualism and all this, But actually, overall, we prefer Toronto. And we can say that now, obviously, because otherwise we would have gone back to Ottawa. Now we've been here now 37 years exactly. So we prefer. It's bigger, of course, there's more traffic and all this. But we like the diversity of the city, which is not the case really in Ottawa now. So it was an education for us to be in contact with people from so many other cultures, speaking languages coming from different countries. I'm always interested in hearing about people's stories, where they come from and why they came here and what were the challenges when they came here. It's amazing stories. And not all, I had it easy going from Ottawa to Toronto, but some of those people coming from Asia and what have you, it was quite a difficult time for them. So so Toronto, we like the variety of things. I mean, restaurants and cultural events. We like, for example, live theater, and there are a lot of smaller theaters in Toronto, Factory Theatre, Tarragon, and you name them. Now we've been to many of them. Fortunately, now we just started to go back actually to those small theaters. Now we had to stop for a couple of years because of COVID, but everything that's happening and the museums and what have you. So overall, and we've made some very good friends. And coming from different cultures and different languages, So overall, it's we like it. We like it.
So you've managed to maintain some of your French culture then in Toronto. Is language sort of a big part of that, or how does that work?
Yes, and speaking of French, French obviously is not as visible in Toronto than it was in the Outaouais or the Ottawa region. And also, in fact, I've read numbers recently in terms of language. People like the census, they ask those questions. What's your mother tongue? And about French is about number 10 on the list in terms of numbers. There's all others before that, Cantonese and Mandarin and Spanish and Italian and so forth. And in terms of mother tongue, and in terms of home language, the language that people speak at home, it's even lower, like number 15. Like I'm a good example of that. My mother tongue is French, but my home language is English because we speak mostly in English at home. My wife can speak French, but my English is better than her French. And same with our daughter, So we do that. Yeah, it's a good question. And just speaking of the language, how do you keep your language if you don't have too many opportunities to practice it, And in fact, somebody asked me that question not too long ago. I was talking with this lady, also from Quebec, but who has been living in Toronto for 25 years. We were speaking French between the two of us, and I could see that she was searching for words, sometimes the French words, and the construction of the sentence a little bit shaky, At the end of our conversation, she told me, Alain, I don't understand. Explain that to me. You say you've been here for all those years. You've been functioning in English for 4 decades.
Yes.
And then you're still very fluent. How did you manage to do that? Okay, I said, you have to remember, I was a translator for 32 years.
Yes.
That means every day I wrote documents in French, making sure that the translation was correct and the French was good.
Yeah.
We're talking here about millions of words over 32 years. That helps. Secondly, Sure, I was working for big corporations that spoke mostly English, but within my company, I was the manager of the translation department. So and we had a few French translators. So between ourselves, we spoke French every day. So that helped too.
Yeah.
And then I kept in touch with my siblings. They're all in Quebec with their families now. We go there regularly. We speak on the phone or Zoom. So I've kept my French pretty good now during all this time. And I still read some stuff in French and watch films in French and so forth. So it's that's why.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So now you've lived here for a long time. Do you have any sort of thoughts about going back to Quebec, or is Ontario still working okay for you?
Well, again, no. People have asked me that question a few times, friends or relatives in Quebec. When are you coming back? You're retired, no? You're not attached to a job, no? You're free to go where you want. When are you coming back to Quebec? And the answer, and same with my wife and our daughter, it's one word: never. You're going to say, why not? Yeah. You were born there. Yes, yeah. Sure, I was born there. Yeah. I spent half of my life here. Yeah. And the first half in Quebec and some other places in the U.S. and in BC. I've been around, but the second half of my life so far, we've been here. Yeah. We live there. This is home. Okay, yeah. So I never say back home. No. This is home. Okay, and so we've made connections here. We have friends. We have our service providers here. It would be hard actually. It would probably be more difficult for me now to go back to Quebec than it was to go from Quebec to here. So as I said, we like it, although, as I said, the French element is not very visible here in Toronto, because in Toronto, there's not a neighborhood that has a high, I don't think so, that they have a high concentration of French-speaking people. It's like Little Italy and Little Greek. I don't think we have a Little Quebec in Toronto, right. Because we're all dispersed and pretty well adapted now to the English language. And many probably most French-speaking people are bilingual, so the language is not really an issue. But no, there are French schools, elementary and secondary. You can take some courses at university level in French. There are French churches. There's a French theater, live theater, le Théâtre Français de Toronto, l'Alliance Française, which is an international organization that promotes French everywhere through different activities and programs and so forth. So if you look, there are ways that you can use and keep your French language. Yeah. But moving back to Quebec, no. We're here to stay.
Yeah. Well, that's most interesting, Alain. And I think to be able to function in two languages, I think is amazing. The best I can do, Alain, is when I pick up something in the grocery store, if it's on the French side, I try to do my bilingual thing and read it.
Good.
Good talking to you, Alain, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.